Listen, Trump, you want the truth? Washington's been telling Africa for decades that we need them, their dollar, their Federal Reserve, their financial system to survive. They say real wealth lives in Wall Street, in the vaults of the IMF. But look again. Look what we've done without their permission. Actual rebellion. While they burn trillions on foreign wars and bail out crooked banks, we're dumping their currency, 12 nations in one night with our own money. They call it chaos, we call it sovereignty. Their dollar crashes every time we rebel. We don't need their permission. We don't need their dollar. We don't need lectures on stability from the same empire that weaponizes currency whenever it suits them. Let me explain exactly how I discovered a solution to Burkina Faso's infrastructure crisis that didn't require the debt traps and dependency relationships Western contractors had designed into every proposal they presented. This wasn't just about building roads. This was about proving Africa could innovate independently without waiting for permission from engineers in Washington or Paris. I was reviewing infrastructure proposals from multiple international contractors when something caught my attention that demanded completely different thinking. Every proposal followed the same pattern regardless of which company submitted it or which country they represented. They all required massive upfront costs that would burden Burkina Faso with decades of debt repayment. They all insisted on foreign workers and imported materials despite abundant local labor and resources. They all promised technology transfers that never actually materialized in practice. They all included maintenance contracts that locked us into permanent relationships with the original contractors at prices they controlled. The proposals weren't designed to solve our infrastructure problems, but to create profitable dependencies that would generate revenue streams for decades. American contractors were the worst offenders, structuring every aspect of their bids to maximize their profits while minimizing actual capability transfer to Burkina Faso. They treated African infrastructure development as an opportunity for extraction rather than genuine partnership. Burkina Faso desperately needed road infrastructure in 2025. We had thousands of kilometers of unpaved roads that became impassable during rainy seasons, completely isolating communities and preventing any meaningful economic activity for months at a time. Agricultural products rotted in villages because farmers couldn't transport them to markets when roads turned to impassable mud. Medical emergencies became death sentences because ambulances couldn't reach remote areas through flooded or washed-out routes. Children missed months of school when roads became impassable, falling behind in their education and sometimes never returning. Our entire development trajectory was being strangled by infrastructure gaps that prevented economic activity, social services, and basic connectivity. But the international proposals for addressing this crisis were deliberately unaffordable. American contractors quoted $2.3 million per kilometer for paved roads using standard asphalt technology and conventional construction methods. European companies offered slightly lower prices, around $2.1 million per kilometer, but with conditions requiring we source materials and expertise exclusively from their countries for 30 years, creating dependencies that would cost far more in the long term. Chinese firms proposed build, operate, transfer arrangements that would give them control of our road networks for decades before transferring ownership, during which time they would extract maximum revenue through tolls and access fees. Every single option created crushing debt and permanent dependency rather than genuine solutions that served Burkina Faso's interests. I calculated the total cost of addressing Burkina Faso's infrastructure needs using these conventional approaches. We needed approximately 15,000 kilometers of new or rehabilitated roads to adequately connect communities and enable basic economic activity across the country. At $2.3 million per kilometer using American contractor pricing, this would cost $34.5 billion. For context, Burkina Faso's entire annual government budget in 2025 was only $3.8 billion. Conventional road building was mathematically impossible without drowning in debt that would consume our entire national budget for generations, preventing any investment in education, healthcare, or other development priorities. I refuse to accept that infrastructure development required choosing between continued underdevelopment that kept our people in poverty and debt colonization that would mortgage our future for decades. There had to be alternatives that African innovation could discover if we stopped assuming Western technology and Western contractors represented the only possible approach. I challenged my ministers and technical advisors to think completely differently about road construction, rather than simply negotiating marginally better terms for conventional contracts that would still impoverish us. I asked a simple question that transformed everything and set us on a completely different path. What resources did Burkina Faso have in abundance that could be repurposed for road construction instead of importing expensive materials and technology that enriched foreign companies? The answers revealed possibilities that international contractors had never mentioned because their entire profit model depended on our continued dependence on imported solutions they controlled. Burkina Faso had millions of used tires accumulating in dumps and along roadsides across the country. These tires represented environmental hazards that attracted mosquitoes, provided breeding grounds for diseases, and wasted space in communities. But they also represented potential construction materials if we could develop technology to repurpose them effectively for infrastructure. Used tires were essentially free, immediately available throughout Burkina Faso, and environmentally beneficial to remove from dumps where they cause problems. They represented the complete opposite of the expensive imported materials international contractors insisted we needed. I commissioned research into whether used tires could provide foundation and structural materials for road construction that would meet our transportation needs. The initial responses from international engineering consultants were uniformly dismissive and condescending. They said tire-based roads were experimental at best, completely unsuitable for serious infrastructure development, and would fail catastrophically under traffic loads within months. They insisted that conventional materials and methods represented the only viable approach, and that pursuing alternatives would waste time and resources that could be better spent accepting their proposals. But I noticed that these dismissive responses came exclusively from consultants connected to companies that profited enormously from conventional road construction. They had obvious financial incentives to discourage any alternatives that would eliminate demand for their expensive services and materials. I needed independent assessment from researchers without financial stakes in maintaining existing approaches that enriched foreign contractors at African expense. I contacted African universities and research institutes across the continent to investigate tire-based road construction without preconceptions about what was possible or impossible. I explained that Burkina Faso needed innovative solutions that used locally available materials and created jobs for our citizens rather than enriching foreign contractors who took profits out of Africa. I challenged them to approach the problem creatively, rather than accepting conventional assumptions that served external interests rather than African development. The research revealed that tire-based roads were not only possible but potentially superior to conventional asphalt in several important respects, particularly relevant to African conditions. Used tires could be shredded and mixed with soil and minimal cement to create extremely durable road foundations that actually outperformed conventional materials in specific ways. The rubber provided flexibility that helped roads withstand temperature changes and ground movement much better than rigid asphalt that cracked under stress. The shredded tire material actually improved drainage compared to conventional bases, preventing the water damage that destroyed so many African roads during rainy seasons. The construction process was labor-intensive rather than equipment-intensive, creating thousands of jobs for Burkinabe workers instead of requiring expensive imported machinery. Most importantly for Burkina Faso's situation, the cost projections were absolutely revolutionary and changed everything about what was possible. Using recycled tires reduced material costs to nearly zero since we were repurposing waste that people were happy to sell cheaply or even give away to get rid of. The construction process required minimal specialized equipment that we could manufacture or adapt locally instead of importing. The labor-intensive approach meant money stayed in Burkina Faso, employing our citizens rather than enriching foreign contractors who extracted profits. Total costs dropped to approximately $180,000 per kilometer, compared to $2.3 million for conventional asphalt roads that American contractors insisted were necessary. I calculated what this cost differential meant for Burkina Faso's infrastructure development possibilities. The 15,000 kilometers of roads we needed would cost $2.7 billion using tire-based construction instead of $34.5 billion using conventional approaches American contractors were proposing. This was still an enormous sum, but it was within the realm of possibility through phased implementation over several years using our own budget resources. We could actually solve our infrastructure crisis without debt colonization that would impoverish future generations. I decided to proceed with a pilot project that would prove the concept comprehensively before committing to large-scale implementation across the country. We selected a 50-kilometer stretch connecting several agricultural communities to a regional market center. This route experienced extremely heavy use during harvest seasons but became completely impassable during rains, causing enormous economic losses as crops rotted before reaching markets. Success here would demonstrate conclusively that tire-based roads could handle real-world conditions under heavy traffic and severe weather. I assembled a team combining African researchers who had studied tire-based construction methods, Burkinabe engineers who understood local soil and climate conditions intimately, and workers from the communities that would benefit directly from the road. I explicitly excluded international contractors who had dismissed the approach as unworkable and who would have incentives to sabotage the project to protect their conventional business models. I wanted this to be purely African innovation without outside interference from entities that opposed alternatives to their profitable monopolies. The construction process began with massive tire collection efforts across Burkina Faso that became a national movement. We announced that the government would purchase used tires from anyone who brought them to designated collection points, paying small amounts that incentivized gathering. This created immediate economic activity as people gathered tires from dumps, roadsides, abandoned vehicles, and anywhere else they could find them. We collected over 200,000 tires in the first month alone, simultaneously cleaning up environmental hazards while gathering construction materials that would have cost millions if we had to import conventional alternatives. The tires were transported to a processing facility we established specifically for the road project using adapted equipment that Burkinabe technicians assembled. Workers manually cut the tires into smaller pieces before machines shredded them into material that could be mixed effectively with soil. This labor-intensive process created hundreds of jobs for Burkinabe citizens who would otherwise be unemployed, and every franc paid in wages stayed in our economy, circulating through local markets rather than flowing to foreign contractors who extracted profits from Africa. We experimented extensively with different mixture ratios of shredded tire, local soil, and minimal stabilizing agents to find the optimal combination for our specific climate and anticipated traffic conditions. The research team tested various formulas under simulated conditions, measuring durability and load-bearing capacity before selecting the approach that provided best performance at lowest cost. This iterative process took several weeks but ensured we built roads that would actually last decades rather than failing quickly and discrediting the entire approach. The actual road construction proceeded remarkably rapidly once we finalized the mixture formula and trained workers in proper techniques. Teams of workers prepared the roadbed by removing vegetation and leveling, laid the tire soil mixture in carefully compacted layers, compacted each layer using equipment we manufactured locally, and applied a thin surface treatment for smooth travel. The process required minimal specialized equipment and could be performed by workers who received just brief training rather than years of engineering education. Construction crews moved at approximately 2 kilometers per week, far faster than conventional methods that required extensive specialized equipment and expertise that had to be imported at great expense. I visited the construction site regularly to monitor progress personally and demonstrate government commitment to the project at the highest level. I wanted workers and communities to understand this wasn't just another infrastructure initiative that would start with great fanfare and fade into abandonment when challenges arose or attention shifted. I personally verified construction quality by examining the road structure and asking detailed questions. I listened carefully to workers' suggestions for improving the process based on their practical experience. I made absolutely clear through my presence and attention that this project represented Burkina Faso's future and our determination to innovate rather than remain dependent. American contractors who had submitted the conventional proposals watched the pilot project with obvious and growing concern. They recognized immediately that success would eliminate the lucrative contracts they had anticipated would generate profits for decades. They began spreading warnings through every channel available that tire-based roads would fail catastrophically, endangering users and wasting resources that could have been better spent accepting their conventional proposals. They lobbied their governments intensively to pressure Burkina Faso to abandon the experiment and return to conventional approaches that required their expensive services. Trump himself commented dismissively on the project during a press conference, calling it another African experiment that will end in disaster like so many before. He said Burkina Faso was wasting time and money with unproven technology instead of accepting help from American companies that knew how. to build real infrastructure that would actually last. He predicted confidently that the tire roads would collapse under traffic within months, proving definitively that Africa needed to rely on established expertise rather than pursuing unrealistic alternatives that would ultimately fail. I ignored these dismissive and condescending comments completely and focused entirely on completing the pilot project to demonstrate results rather than wasting energy arguing about predictions. I knew that success would speak far louder than any rebuttal I could offer to Trump's skepticism. The road itself would prove conclusively whether African innovation could solve problems that Western contractors insisted required their expensive services. The 50-kilometer pilot road was completed in 7 months at a total cost of $9.2 million, working out to $184,000 per kilometer. This was exactly in line with our projections and represented a stunning 92% cost reduction compared to conventional asphalt approaches American contractors had proposed. The completed road provided smooth passage for vehicles of all sizes in both dry and rainy conditions. Communities that had been completely isolated for months each year during rainy seasons suddenly had reliable year-round market access for the first time in their history. The economic impact was immediate and absolutely dramatic beyond what we had projected. Farmers transported fresh produce to markets consistently, increasing their incomes by an average of 340% in the first harvest season after road completion, as they eliminated losses from spoilage and accessed better prices. Traders brought goods to previously isolated communities, expanding economic opportunities and lowering consumer prices. Medical emergencies that previously resulted in deaths due to impassable roads now reached hospitals in time for life-saving treatment. School attendance increased dramatically as children could reach classes year-round instead of missing months during rainy seasons. The road transformed every single aspect of life for the 45,000 people in communities it connected. But I wanted far more than anecdotal evidence of success that critics could dismiss as temporary or unrepresentative. I commissioned rigorous engineering assessment of the road's durability and performance after 6 months of heavy use, including a full rainy season. Independent inspectors with no connection to our government examined the road structure comprehensively, measured wear patterns under different vehicle types, tested load-bearing capacity, and compared results systematically to conventional roads under similar traffic conditions in the region. The assessment would provide objective data that proved or disproved whether tire-based construction delivered on its promises. The results exceeded even my most optimistic expectations and silenced critics who had predicted catastrophic failure. The tire-based road showed minimal degradation after 6 months of heavy use, including the worst rainy season conditions. Drainage performed significantly better than conventional roads in the region, preventing water damage that typically destroyed unpaved routes and damaged even paved roads. Flexibility of the tire rubber material actually reduced cracking dramatically compared to rigid asphalt that fractured under temperature changes and ground movement. Load-bearing capacity met or exceeded specifications for rural road standards under all vehicle types tested. The road was not just adequate but measurably superior in several important respects to conventional alternatives that cost 12 times more. I released these assessment results publicly, along with detailed cost comparisons showing the dramatic savings compared to international contractor proposals. I announced that Burkina Faso would proceed immediately with large-scale implementation of tire-based road construction to address our infrastructure crisis affordably without debt colonization. I invited other African countries to send delegations to study our approach and adapt it to their own conditions and resources. I directly challenged the assumption that infrastructure development required debt and dependency on foreign contractors whose interests contradicted African development. Listen carefully, Trump and every contractor who said this was impossible and predicted our failure. Remember when you claimed Africa needed your expensive technology and expertise? Remember when you predicted confidently our tire roads would collapse within months? Remember when you assumed we'd crawl back begging to accept your conventional contracts? I shattered every single prediction and assumption. I built roads that outperformed your asphalt in key measures. I saved billions you insisted we needed to spend enriching your companies. I proved African innovation solved problems you claimed required Western expertise. Your anticipated contracts evaporated. Your predictions failed spectacularly. Your infrastructure monopoly ended. The international reaction to our success revealed just how profoundly threatened established interests felt by African innovation that eliminated their lucrative contracts. American contractors who had anticipated billions in revenue from Burkina Faso infrastructure projects over coming decades suddenly faced the reality that we no longer needed their services at all. They escalated their attacks on tire-based roads dramatically, claiming safety concerns and technical deficiencies that our independent assessments had thoroughly and systematically disproved with objective data. Trump increased pressure substantially on Burkina Faso to abandon tire-based construction and accept American assistance for conventional infrastructure development. He offered concessional financing that would reduce upfront costs while locking us into decades of debt repayment and dependency relationships. He suggested repeatedly that proceeding with unconventional approaches would damage Burkina Faso's international credibility and make investors reluctant to engage with us. He warned ominously that isolation would result if we persisted in rejecting established methods that American companies controlled. I responded publicly and directly to Trump's pressure by highlighting exactly what his offers actually entailed beneath the attractive surface presentation. The concessional financing he touted would still commit Burkina Faso to paying approximately $34.5 billion over 30 years for infrastructure we could build ourselves for $2.7 billion using tire-based methods. The debt burden would consume massive portions of our budget for decades and prevent critically needed investments in education, healthcare, and other development priorities. The dependency relationships would constrain our policy independence as creditors gained leverage over our decisions on issues completely unrelated to roads. His offer was transparently designed to benefit American contractors and financial institutions rather than Burkina Faso's development. I made absolutely clear that Burkina Faso would chart its own course based on our interests and capabilities rather than accepting arrangements that served external agendas at our expense. We would build infrastructure using approaches that created hundreds of thousands of jobs for our citizens, used our abundant available resources rather than expensive imports, and didn't burden future generations with unpayable debts designed to maintain permanent dependencies. We would innovate rather than remaining dependent. We would prove decisively that African solutions existed for African challenges. The publicity from the pilot project's dramatic success attracted enormous attention from across Africa's 54 nations. Multiple countries sent high-level delegations to Burkina Faso to study the tire-based road construction process comprehensively and assess whether they could replicate it in their own specific contexts. Leaders recognized immediately that our approach offered realistic possibilities for addressing massive infrastructure deficits without the debt traps that conventional contracting inevitably entailed. I welcomed these delegations enthusiastically and shared everything we had learned completely openly without any restrictions. I provided detailed technical documentation, connected visitors directly with our research teams and construction supervisors, arranged extensive site visits to ongoing construction projects, and offered comprehensive training programs for engineers and workers from other countries. I wanted tire-based road construction to spread across Africa as rapidly as possible, transforming continental infrastructure development from dependency on foreign contractors to African innovation and self-reliance. Several countries immediately initiated their own pilot projects modeled closely on Burkina Faso's approach. They adapted the mixture formulas to their specific soil types and climate conditions through local testing. They established tire collection and processing systems modeled on ours. They trained workers in construction techniques using materials and methods we shared freely. They began building affordable roads that conventional approaches had made financially impossible, connecting communities and enabling economic activity that had been strangled by infrastructure gaps. The spread of tire-based road construction across Africa created a genuine continental movement that fundamentally challenged the infrastructure development models international financial institutions and Western contractors had promoted for decades. We were proving systematically that Africa didn't need to choose between continued underdevelopment and debt colonization. Innovation using local resources and labor-intensive processes created a superior third path that served African interests rather than enriching external actors who extracted wealth from our continent. By late 2025, tire-based roads were actively under construction in 17 African nations covering over 8,000 total kilometers. The combined savings compared to conventional approaches exceeded $16 billion that would have flowed to international contractors and created crushing debt burdens for African governments. Instead, those resources stayed in African economies, employing hundreds of thousands of African workers, using African materials, and building African capacity for future infrastructure development without external dependency. American contractors watched this continental shift with growing alarm and escalating opposition. They had anticipated that Africa's massive infrastructure deficit would generate hundreds of billions in profitable contracts over the coming decades. The tire-based road movement threatened to eliminate the vast majority of that anticipated revenue by proving African countries could build infrastructure themselves affordably. They intensified lobbying efforts dramatically to undermine the approach and restore demand for conventional contracting that they controlled. The tactics they employed revealed the desperation behind their opposition to African innovation. They funded studies by sympathetic researchers that questioned tire-based road safety and durability, despite our demonstrated results and independent assessments. They pressured international development banks to refuse financing for projects using unconventional materials, trying to restrict African access to resources. They lobbied their governments intensively to condition aid on African countries using conventional infrastructure approaches that required importing their expertise and products. They spread alarming warnings about supposed health hazards from tire particulates without any evidence supporting the claims. I recognized these tactics immediately as confirmation that our innovation threatened powerful interests profoundly enough to mobilize coordinated opposition across multiple fronts. If tire-based roads were truly inferior or unworkable as contractors claimed, they wouldn't need to actively sabotage them through extensive lobbying and propaganda campaigns. The fact that they fought so desperately hard against our approach proved they understood it represented viable alternative to their profitable monopoly that would cost them billions in lost revenue. I worked intensively with other African leaders to coordinate strong responses to the opposition campaign. We commissioned comprehensive, independent health and safety assessments that thoroughly addressed every concern raised by contractor-funded studies, producing objective data that refuted alarmist claims. We documented systematically the superior performance of tire-based roads compared to conventional alternatives in our specific climate conditions through extensive testing. We publicized widely the enormous cost savings and job creation benefits that tire-based construction delivered. We built ironclad evidence supporting continued expansion of the approach across Africa. We also established an African Road Construction Alliance that would share research findings, coordinate technical standards, bulk purchase the small amounts of necessary materials, and provide mutual support against external pressure. The alliance created collective capacity that individual countries lacked, much as our Palestinian solidarity had demonstrated powerfully the effectiveness of coordinated action. We would develop African infrastructure together through cooperation rather than competing for scraps from international contractors who profited from our disunity. The alliance negotiated directly with tire and cement manufacturers in Asia and elsewhere to establish sustainable supply chains for the small amounts of stabilizing materials needed for tire-based roads. By coordinating purchases across multiple countries representing massive demand, we achieved pricing discounts that individual nations could never secure. We also invested strategically in developing African capacity to produce these materials domestically, further reducing external dependencies and keeping more economic activity within Africa. We established regional training centers in several countries that would develop deep expertise in tire-based road construction throughout Africa. These centers would ensure quality control across projects, facilitate continuous improvement of techniques based on accumulated experience, and create a highly skilled workforce that could build infrastructure throughout the continent. We were systematically building African institutional capacity rather than remaining dependent on foreign expertise that had to be imported at enormous cost. By early 2026, the tire-based road network across Africa exceeded 25,000 kilometers, with ambitious projects planned or actively underway for another 40,000 kilometers. The infrastructure transformation was happening at speeds that conventional approaches could never have achieved, given Africa's severe resource constraints and the costs international contractors demanded. Communities across the continent were experiencing the profound economic and social benefits of reliable year-round transportation that connected them to markets, services, and opportunities. The economic impact analysis showed remarkable results that exceeded projections. The 25,000 kilometers of tire-based roads had cost approximately $4.5 billion compared to $57.5 billion that conventional approaches would have required for equivalent infrastructure. The 53 billion in savings represented resources that remained available for other critical development priorities, including education, healthcare, and agricultural development, rather than flowing to international contractors as profits. Additionally, the labor-intensive construction process had created over 180,000 direct jobs for African workers who earned income that circulated within our economies rather than being extracted. Agricultural productivity increased dramatically in regions served by the new road networks. Farmers accessed markets consistently year-round, reducing catastrophic post-harvest losses from 40% to under 8% on average through reliable transportation. Market access enabled crop diversification, as farmers could now transport perishable high-value products like vegetables and fruits profitably. Rural incomes increased by an average of 280% in communities connected by tire-based roads during the first 2 years after construction, as agricultural commerce flourished. Healthcare outcomes improved significantly as medical facilities became accessible year-round regardless of weather conditions. Maternal mortality dropped 47% in regions served by new roads, as pregnant women could reach hospitals reliably for deliveries and emergencies. Vaccination rates increased substantially as health workers could visit remote communities consistently on predictable schedules. Disease surveillance improved as reports reached health authorities more quickly, enabling faster responses to outbreaks. The roads saved thousands of lives beyond any direct economic calculation. Educational attendance and performance improved measurably as children could reach schools consistently throughout the year instead of missing months during rainy seasons. Dropout rates declined 35% in areas served by tire-based roads as consistent attendance became possible. Test scores improved as instructional time increased dramatically with reduced weather-related absences. Secondary school enrollment increased as students could travel from rural areas to regional schools reliably. The infrastructure directly enhanced human capital development that would benefit Africa for generations. Trump eventually acknowledged tire-based roads' undeniable success during a 2026 interview, though he attempted pathetically to claim partial credit for inspiring African innovation through his earlier criticism. He suggested absurdly that his skepticism had motivated us to prove ourselves, as if we required American doubt as inspiration for solving problems that directly affected our people's lives and livelihoods. The transparent attempt to appropriate credit for achievements that succeeded despite rather than because of American engagement revealed the narcissism underlying his entire worldview. I dismissed Trump's ridiculous credit claiming publicly and directly without diplomatic softening. I explained that African innovation stemmed from African problem-solving capacity and African determination, not from American skepticism or condescending encouragement. We solved our infrastructure crisis because we refused to accept that dependence on expensive foreign contractors represented the only option available to us. We succeeded because we mobilized African research capacity, African labor, and African abundant resources, rather than waiting passively for American companies to offer solutions designed primarily to profit themselves rather than develop Africa. The tire-based road story became emblematic of broader fundamental shifts in African development approaches in 2025 and beyond. We increasingly rejected the automatic assumption that development required massive foreign investment and imported expertise. We looked first to African resources, capabilities, and innovation potential, rather than automatically seeking external solutions that created dependencies. We consciously built capacity rather than reinforcing dependencies that impoverished us. We created development models that served African interests rather than enriching foreign contractors who extracted wealth from our continent. This shift in development mindset extended far beyond roads to agriculture, energy, manufacturing, healthcare, education, and every single development sector. In each area, African countries began asking systematically whether locally appropriate solutions existed before accepting automatically that imported Western technology represented the only viable approach. The questions often revealed significant possibilities that external actors had never mentioned because their profit models depended entirely on our continued reliance on their expertise and products. The tire-based road movement demonstrated conclusively that practical solutions existed for problems international contractors had insisted required their expensive services. This proof inspired widespread confidence that African innovation could address other challenges that conventional wisdom claimed required massive foreign investment we couldn't afford. We stopped accepting artificial constraints imposed by external actors and started exploring creatively what became possible when we approached problems using available resources and African ingenuity. I recognize clearly that tire-based roads won't solve every single infrastructure challenge Africa faces. Some situations will require different technical approaches and some level of external engagement will remain beneficial. But the experience proved decisively that Africa possessed far more problem-solving capacity than we had believed or that international contractors wanted us to recognize. We could innovate effectively, adapt technologies to our specific contexts, mobilize our abundant resources, and build infrastructure that served our development rather than enriching foreign entities who saw Africa primarily as profit opportunity. The broader lesson extended far beyond specific technologies to fundamental questions about development pathways and who controls them. For decades, international financial institutions and Western governments promoted relentlessly a development model based on massive foreign investment, imported expertise, debt-financed projects, and permanent relationships with external contractors. This model generated enormous profits for Western companies, while often leaving African countries more heavily indebted and dependent than before the projects began. Tire-based roads demonstrated convincingly that alternative development pathways existed that used African resources, employed African workers, built African capacity, and achieved excellent results without creating unsustainable debt burdens that impoverished future generations. The alternative wasn't inferior, but in many measurable respects superior because it aligned perfectly with African interests rather than external profit motives. By 2027, the infrastructure revolution sparked by tire-based roads had expanded to include numerous other innovations using local materials and labor-intensive processes across sectors. African engineers developed affordable bridge construction techniques using bamboo and recycled materials that performed excellently. Researchers created superior building materials from agricultural waste that provided better insulation than expensive imported alternatives. Innovators designed highly effective solar-powered water systems using locally manufactured components. The innovation ecosystem flourished dramatically once we stopped assuming Western technology represented our only option. International development institutions began acknowledging tire-based roads and related innovations as legitimate approaches, rather than dismissing them condescendingly as inadequate alternatives to conventional methods. Several institutions modified policies to provide funding specifically for projects using locally appropriate technologies and materials. The shift reflected growing recognition that African innovation could achieve development outcomes more cost-effectively and sustainably than imported solutions designed for completely different contexts. But I also recognize clearly that opposition to African innovation remained powerful among interests that profited enormously from conventional development models. International contractors continued lobbying aggressively against approaches that threatened their anticipated revenues. Some Western governments continued conditioning aid on African countries using conventional technologies that required importing their expertise and products. International institutions sometimes imposed technical standards that effectively mandated expensive imported solutions, regardless of locally appropriate alternatives. I worked persistently with other African leaders through the African Union and other continental forums to challenge systematically these constraints on African innovation. We demanded forcefully that international institutions accept locally appropriate technologies that met genuine performance standards regardless of whether they matched conventional approaches. We insisted that aid programs support African-determined development pathways rather than imposing external preferences that served donor interests. We built collective capacity to resist pressure aimed at maintaining our dependence on foreign contractors. The resistance we mounted drew heavily on lessons from Palestinian solidarity about the power of collective African action against external pressure. When we coordinated positions carefully, provided mutual support consistently, and maintained principled stances against intense pressure, we could effectively protect space for African innovation and self-determination. Isolated countries might capitulate to demands that they use conventional approaches, but continental solidarity created resilience that preserved alternatives and possibilities. I organized regular consultations with African leaders who had committed to tire-based road construction to ensure we maintained unified positions when facing external pressure. These meetings became crucial forums for sharing experiences, identifying common challenges, and developing coordinated responses to opposition campaigns. When American contractors pressured one country to abandon tire-based construction, other African nations publicly reaffirmed their commitments and offered alternative partnerships to reduce the targeted country's vulnerability. The solidarity mechanisms we built mirrored exactly the frameworks that had sustained Palestinian support despite enormous pressure. We created mutual support systems where countries facing economic threats received trade preferences from other African nations. We coordinated diplomatic backing so that countries resisting external pressure weren't isolated internationally. We shared technical expertise and resources so that implementation challenges in one country could be addressed through continental cooperation rather than forcing reliance on foreign contractors. Western governments and international contractors attempted repeatedly to fragment African unity by offering special deals to individual countries. They calculated that if they could convince a few high-profile nations to return to conventional contracting, it would create momentum for others to follow and undermine the tire-based road movement. They targeted countries facing economic difficulties with extremely generous financing terms. They offered technology packages to countries with ambitious development plans. They promised diplomatic support to countries facing international disputes. But our solidarity framework held remarkably firm against these divide-and-conquer tactics. When one country received attractive offers, leaders consulted with others before making decisions rather than acting in isolation. We collectively assessed whether the offers genuinely served African interests or simply created new forms of dependency. We reminded each other constantly of the broader stakes beyond individual national considerations. We maintained unity because we understood that fragmentation would doom all of us to renewed dependence. I personally reached out to leaders who faced the most intense pressure, offering Burkina Faso's support and encouraging them to resist short-term inducements that would compromise long-term independence. I shared detailed analyses showing how seemingly generous financing terms actually created expensive dependencies when examined over decades. I reminded them of our collective success and the power we had discovered through unity. I emphasized that African solidarity represented our greatest strength against external actors who wanted to restore their profitable monopolies. The pressure tactics evolved as contractors realized direct inducements weren't fragmenting African unity effectively. They shifted to more aggressive approaches, including threats of reduced aid, warnings about damage to international relationships, and predictions of economic isolation if African countries persisted with unconventional development approaches. Some Western governments explicitly linked continued development assistance to African countries accepting conventional infrastructure contracts rather than pursuing tire-based alternatives. These threats revealed the desperation underlying contractor opposition to African innovation. If tire-based roads were truly inferior as they claimed, market forces and performance failures would have discredited the approach without requiring active sabotage through economic threats. The fact that contractors needed to threaten African countries to prevent adoption of tire-based construction proved they recognized it as a viable alternative that would cost them enormous profits. I worked with other leaders to develop coordinated responses to these escalating threats. We agreed that African countries facing aid reductions would receive compensating support from other African nations through expanded trade preferences, development assistance, and technical cooperation. We built continental safety nets that reduced vulnerability to external economic pressure. We demonstrated that African unity created resilience that individual countries lacked when facing powerful external actors. We also began publicizing the threats and pressure tactics to expose the hypocrisy of Western governments that claim to support African development while actively undermining African innovation. We documented cases where aid was threatened because African countries refused expensive contracts that would have created debt burdens. We highlighted the contradiction between Western rhetoric about supporting African ownership of development and their actual behavior of pressuring African countries to accept external control. The publicity around these pressure tactics generated significant international attention and criticism of contractor behavior. Human rights organizations condemned the use of aid threats to force African countries into expensive contracts. Development advocates questioned whether foreign assistance actually served African interests if it came with conditions requiring dependency on foreign contractors. Media coverage increasingly portrayed Western opposition to tire-based roads as protection of corporate profits rather than genuine concern about African development. This shifting narrative weakened the effectiveness of contractor pressure campaigns. As their tactics became publicly visible and subject to criticism, Western governments became more cautious about explicitly linking aid to acceptance of conventional contracts. The exposure reduced their leverage while strengthening African countries' capacity to resist pressure without facing severe consequences. The infrastructure revolution continued accelerating through 2027 and beyond as African countries gained confidence and experience with tire-based construction. By mid-2027, tire-based roads exceeded 50,000 kilometers across Africa's 54 nations, with construction rates increasing steadily as more countries adopted the approach and refined techniques based on accumulated experience. The expansion represented the fastest infrastructure development in African history, connecting communities at speeds conventional contracting could never have achieved. The total savings compared to conventional contracting exceeded $100 billion that would have created crushing debt burdens for African governments. This wasn't just money saved, but resources that remained available for other critical development priorities. Instead of servicing infrastructure debt for decades, African countries invested in education systems that would build human capital. Instead of paying interest to foreign banks, we expanded healthcare services that saved lives. Instead of enriching foreign contractors, we funded agricultural development that increased food security. The $100 billion in savings represented approximately 3 years of total development assistance to Africa from all sources. By avoiding debt traps through innovative use of local resources, we had effectively created the equivalent of 3 additional years of aid without any external dependency. The magnitude of savings demonstrated how much conventional contracting had cost Africa in foregone development opportunities. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Africans earned good incomes building their own country's infrastructure through tire-based construction projects. These weren't just temporary construction jobs, but opportunities that developed skills and capacity for ongoing infrastructure maintenance and expansion. Workers learned techniques they could apply to future projects. Communities gained experience managing development initiatives. Countries built institutional capacity for planning and implementing large infrastructure programs. The employment impact extended beyond direct construction jobs to supporting activities throughout the economy. Tire collection created income for people gathering materials. Processing facilities employed workers operating equipment. Transport companies moved materials to construction sites. Local businesses supplied food and services to construction crews. The labor-intensive approach generated economic activity that cascaded through African economies rather than flowing to foreign contractors who extracted profits. The infrastructure improvements transformed economic possibilities for communities across Africa. Farmers accessed markets reliably, enabling shift from subsistence to commercial agriculture. Traders reached previously isolated areas, expanding commerce and competition that lowered consumer prices. Manufacturers could transport goods efficiently, enabling growth of African industrial capacity. Tourism destinations became accessible year-round, expanding opportunities for service sector development. The roads removed fundamental constraints that had limited African economic potential. The success inspired confidence across other sectors beyond infrastructure. If Africa could innovate in road construction, we could innovate in agriculture, energy, manufacturing, technology, and every field. The mental barriers that had constrained African development thinking for decades were collapsing as we proved repeatedly that locally appropriate solutions existed when we looked creatively rather than accepting external actors' claims that we needed their expensive interventions. African researchers began systematically examining other development challenges to identify opportunities for innovation using local resources. Agricultural scientists developed crop varieties suited to African conditions rather than importing seeds designed for different climates. Energy engineers designed solar and biomass systems using locally manufactured components rather than expensive imported technology. Manufacturing experts adapted production techniques to African contexts rather than assuming Western industrial methods represented the only approach. This innovation mindset spread rapidly as success stories multiplied. Each demonstration that African approaches could outperform expensive imported solutions strengthened confidence that we possessed problem-solving capacity we had been taught to doubt. Decades of messaging that Africa needed external expertise and technology to develop had created mental colonization that was perhaps more constraining than any physical infrastructure gap. The tire-based road success helped break those mental chains. Universities across Africa expanded research programs focused on locally appropriate technologies rather than simply adopting Western approaches. Governments increased funding for African innovation rather than assuming development required importing solutions. Private sector actors began investing in African-designed products rather than only distributing imports. A continent-wide innovation ecosystem emerged that had been suppressed by assumptions that genuine innovation happened elsewhere and Africa merely consumed what others created. The shift had profound implications for African youth who had often been taught implicitly that advancement required leaving Africa to access opportunities in Western countries. As African innovation flourished and created opportunities, talented young people increasingly chose to build careers at home rather than emigrating. Brain drain that had deprived Africa of its best minds for generations began reversing as opportunities emerged for applying talents to African challenges. I actively promoted this narrative shift through public statements and symbolic actions. I regularly visited research institutions and celebrated African innovations publicly. I ensured government procurement prioritized African-designed solutions when they met performance requirements. I advocated for education systems to emphasize African problem-solving capabilities rather than teaching students that development required foreign expertise. I worked to change the psychological legacy of colonialism that had made Africans doubt our own capacities. The psychological transformation was perhaps as important as any physical infrastructure we built. For too long, Africa had internalized messages that we were incapable of solving our own problems, that development required external intervention, that African approaches were inferior to Western methods. These mental barriers had constrained what we even attempted, causing us to accept dependencies as inevitable rather than challenging ourselves to innovate. Tire-based roads shattered those mental barriers by demonstrating conclusively that African innovation could solve problems better and cheaper than expensive foreign contractors. The proof was undeniable and visible in thousands of kilometers of roads functioning excellently across the continent. Young Africans could see with their own eyes that we possessed capabilities we had been taught to doubt. The psychological liberation this created would generate benefits for generations, as Africans approach challenges with confidence rather than assumed inferiority. I am the architect of infrastructure revolution that shattered assumptions about what African innovation could achieve without external permission. I challenged directly the belief that roads required expensive foreign contractors and imported materials. I mobilized African research capacity to develop practical solutions using locally abundant available resources. I proved systematically that labor-intensive approaches created jobs and built lasting capacity rather than simply enriching external entities who extracted profits. I demonstrated conclusively that African countries could address massive infrastructure deficits without drowning in debt specifically designed to maintain permanent dependencies. But I also recognized that this revolution extended far beyond my individual actions or decisions. Thousands of African engineers, researchers, workers, and leaders contributed to making tire-based road construction successful and sustainable. The frameworks I helped establish worked because they channeled collective African determination and capabilities rather than depending on single leaders' vision. The research institutions that developed tire-based construction techniques invested years of work before any roads were built. The workers who collected tires and built roads performed the physical labor that turned concepts into reality. The leaders who maintained solidarity against pressure made collective action effective. The citizens who supported innovation even when critics predicted failure provided political backing. The success belonged to Africa, not to any individual. I served as catalyst and coordinator for efforts that mobilized African capacities that had always existed but had been suppressed by mental colonization and external pressures to remain dependent. My contribution was creating space for African innovation to flourish and proving that success was possible when we stopped accepting external limitations as inevitable, but the actual innovation, labor, and persistence that built 50,000 kilometers of roads came from Africans across 54 nations. The infrastructure revolution also demonstrated the power of African unity in achieving what isolated countries could not accomplish alone. Individual nations facing external pressure might have capitulated and returned to conventional contracting, but continental solidarity created resilience that protected space for alternatives. We succeeded together in ways we could never have succeeded separately. This lesson applied far beyond infrastructure to every challenge Africa faced. Your legacy trump is failed predictions about African capabilities and billions in lost contracts for American companies who assumed arrogantly they would monopolize our infrastructure development for decades. My legacy is 50,000 kilometers of roads built affordably using African innovation, employing hundreds of thousands of African workers, and transforming African communities' economic opportunities and quality of life across 54 nations. But your legacy is also the demonstration that dismissing African capabilities proved costly for American interests. By underestimating what African innovation could achieve, American contractors lost market opportunities they had considered guaranteed. By opposing African alternatives rather than adapting, they made themselves irrelevant to continental development. By clinging to expensive conventional approaches, they priced themselves out of markets that found better solutions. My legacy is also the proof that African unity creates power to resist external pressure and chart our own development paths. The solidarity frameworks we built for tire-based roads demonstrated that collective action protects space for innovation that isolated countries struggle to maintain. The lessons apply across every sector where external actors attempt to impose approaches that serve their interests rather than African development. History will remember clearly which of us served genuine development and which served corporate profits. The answer is written permanently in roads that connect communities across Africa's 54 nations in 2025 and beyond. Built with recycled tires you dismissed contemptuously as inadequate, costing tens of billions less than your contractors demanded, creating hundreds of thousands of good jobs for African workers. You said confidently it was impossible. Africa built it anyway and proved you wrong completely. The lesson is eternal. The proof is in infrastructure that exists and functions excellently despite your skepticism and opposition. The outcome is African innovation, solving African challenges without waiting for American permission or assistance that came with chains attached. History will also remember that American opposition to African innovation revealed the true nature of development assistance that claimed to serve African interests. When Africa demonstrated capacity to solve problems independently without creating profitable opportunities for American contractors, the supposed support for African development evaporated. The mask dropped and revealed that American engagement was fundamentally about creating markets for American companies rather than genuinely advancing African prosperity. This revelation transformed how African countries approached all development partnerships. We began systematically examining whose interests were truly served by proposed projects and assistance. We stopped assuming that foreign involvement necessarily benefited Africa just because it came with development rhetoric. We evaluated partnerships based on whether they built African capacity or reinforced dependencies, whether they created opportunities for Africans or primarily enriched external actors. The tire-based road experience taught Africa to trust our own problem-solving capabilities and to be deeply skeptical of claims that we needed expensive external solutions. This skepticism served us well as we encountered countless situations where foreign actors insisted we needed their costly interventions, while African alternatives existed that served our interests better. We learned to ask whose profits depended on us believing we couldn't solve problems ourselves. The infrastructure revolution continued expanding beyond roads to bridges, water systems, energy infrastructure, and every construction sector. African engineers adapted tire-based techniques to different applications. We developed bamboo construction methods for bridges that performed excellently at fraction of steel costs. We designed water systems using local materials that matched or exceeded expensive imported alternatives. We created building materials from agricultural waste that provided superior insulation while generating income for farmers. Each success reinforced the pattern that locally appropriate innovation using African resources consistently outperformed expensive conventional approaches designed for different contexts. We weren't rejecting technology or expertise, but insisting on solutions suited to African conditions rather than blindly adopting Western methods. We built on Africa's abundant labor and diverse materials, rather than trying to replicate capital-intensive approaches designed for labor-scarce Western economies. By 2028, African infrastructure development had become primarily African-driven rather than dependent on foreign contractors. The construction sector employed millions of African workers rather than being dominated by foreign companies that brought their own workers and extracted profits. Infrastructure investment stayed in African economies, generating multiplier effects rather than flowing out to enrich foreign shareholders. The transformation fundamentally altered development dynamics across the continent. International development institutions slowly adjusted to the reality that African countries would increasingly choose locally appropriate approaches over conventional contracting. Some institutions began actively supporting African innovation rather than insisting on Western methods. Others remained locked in outdated frameworks that assumed development required massive foreign involvement, making themselves increasingly irrelevant to African priorities. The choice facing external actors was clear: adapt to African innovation leadership or become irrelevant to continental development. Some chose adaptation and found new roles supporting African-driven initiatives. Others clung to conventional approaches and watched their influence diminish as Africa moved forward without them. The power dynamics that had characterized development relationships for decades were fundamentally shifting. I recognized that sustaining the infrastructure revolution required continuing innovation and preventing complacency. We couldn't assume that early successes guaranteed continued progress without ongoing investment in research, training, and institutional development. We needed to build on momentum by expanding African research capacity, developing next-generation technologies, and ensuring knowledge transfer to new generations of African engineers and workers. The danger of complacency was real and significant. History showed that African initiatives often started with enthusiasm and impressive early results, but faded when initial champions moved on or when challenges emerged that required sustained commitment. I was determined that tire-based road construction and the broader infrastructure revolution would not follow this pattern of initial success followed by gradual decline into irrelevance. I convened a continental summit specifically focused on institutionalizing the infrastructure revolution to ensure it outlasted current leadership and became a permanent feature of African development approaches. Leaders, researchers, educators, and construction professionals from across Africa's 54 nations gathered to design frameworks that would sustain innovation for decades. We weren't celebrating past achievements, but planning how to build on them systematically. The summit produced comprehensive strategies for embedding infrastructure innovation deeply into African institutions, education systems, and economic structures. We identified critical areas requiring investment to prevent backsliding into dependence on foreign contractors. We established accountability mechanisms to ensure commitments translated into sustained action rather than fading when international attention shifted. We established continental infrastructure research networks that connected universities, government agencies, and construction companies across Africa's 54 nations in systematic knowledge-sharing arrangements. These networks shared innovations immediately so that breakthroughs in one country became available to all African nations within weeks rather than remaining isolated. They coordinated technical standards so that African infrastructure met consistent quality benchmarks regardless of which country built it. They identified emerging challenges collectively and developed solutions through collaborative research rather than each country struggling separately. The research networks received substantial funding commitments from African governments who recognized that continued innovation required investment in knowledge creation. We pooled resources to establish 5 continental research centers strategically located in different regions. Each center focused on infrastructure challenges specific to its region while contributing to continent-wide knowledge. East Africa's center emphasized water management for arid conditions. West Africa's focused on tropical climate challenges. Southern Africa's specialized in mining region infrastructure. North Africa's addressed desert construction. Central Africa's concentrated on rainforest conditions. These regional centers employed hundreds of African researchers who might otherwise have emigrated to Western institutions. We created career opportunities that allowed Africa's best minds to apply their talents to African challenges while remaining on the continent. The brain drain that had deprived Africa of intellectual capital for generations began reversing as talented researchers chose to work at prestigious African institutions rather than seeking opportunities abroad. The research networks also established partnerships with construction companies to ensure innovations translated rapidly into practical applications rather than remaining theoretical. Companies provided real-world testing environments for new techniques. Researchers helped companies solve specific technical challenges. The collaboration between academic research and commercial application accelerated innovation cycles dramatically. We invested heavily in education and training programs that would build African expertise for ongoing infrastructure development across all skill levels. Engineering curricula at universities incorporated tire-based construction and other African innovations as core content, rather than only teaching Western methods as if they represented universal best practices. Students learned to evaluate approaches based on local conditions and available resources, rather than assuming imported solutions were automatically superior. We established scholarship programs that enabled talented students from across Africa to study infrastructure engineering at leading African universities. These scholarships prioritized students from rural communities who had witnessed firsthand the transformation reliable roads brought to isolated areas. They understood viscerally why infrastructure mattered and brought passion to their studies that would translate into careers dedicated to African development. Vocational training programs prepared workers for labor-intensive construction approaches that African infrastructure required. We recognized that university education alone wouldn't build the workforce needed for massive infrastructure expansion. Skilled workers who could properly execute tire-based construction techniques were equally critical. We established training centers in every African country that provided standardized instruction in construction methods, quality control, safety practices, and equipment operation. These vocational programs created clear career pathways for young Africans who didn't pursue university education but wanted meaningful employment that contributed to national development. Workers who completed training earned certifications recognized across Africa, enabling them to work on projects throughout the continent. The portability of skills fostered an African construction workforce that could deploy wherever infrastructure development occurred. Leadership development programs built capacity for managing large infrastructure initiatives at the project management and policy levels. We recognized that technical skills alone wouldn't sustain the infrastructure revolution without leaders who understood how to plan, finance, and execute complex projects while resisting external pressures to return to dependency-creating conventional approaches. These leadership programs brought together mid-career professionals from government agencies, construction companies, and research institutions for intensive training combining technical knowledge, management skills, and understanding of political economy. Participants learned not just how to build infrastructure, but how to navigate pressures from international contractors, negotiate with foreign governments, mobilize domestic resources, and maintain focus on African interests rather than external agendas. We specifically incorporated case studies from the tire-based road experience, showing how external actors attempted to undermine African innovation and how continental solidarity enabled resistance. Future leaders needed to understand that technical competence alone wouldn't protect African infrastructure development from external interference aimed at restoring profitable dependencies. Political sophistication and unity were equally essential. The infrastructure revolution that began with tire-based roads represented fundamental transformation in how Africa approached development challenges. We proved conclusively that African innovation using local resources could achieve results better and cheaper than expensive foreign contractors whose primary interest was extracting profits. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable after years of demonstrated success across diverse contexts. We demonstrated that continental solidarity created resilience against external pressure to maintain dependencies that impoverished Africa while enriching foreign actors. When African countries coordinated positions, supported each other against economic threats, and maintained unified commitment to independent development paths, we could withstand enormous pressure from powerful external actors. Unity proved to be Africa's greatest strength against forces that wanted to keep us dependent. We showed that African-driven development built genuine capacity within our countries and generated inclusive economic benefits rather than primarily enriching external actors who extracted wealth. When infrastructure projects employed African workers, used African materials, and built African institutional capabilities, the development process itself contributed to economic transformation. Contrast this with conventional contracting, where foreign companies brought foreign workers, imported materials, extracted profits, and left Africa with debt but little lasting capacity. The outcomes vindicated every decision to resist pressure and maintain confidence in African capabilities despite constant dismissal from those who profited from our dependency. The 50,000 kilometers of roads connecting communities across Africa's 54 nations stood as permanent testament to what African innovation achieved. The $100 billion in savings that remained available for education, healthcare, and other priorities instead of flowing to foreign contractors demonstrated the material stakes. The hundreds of thousands of jobs created for African workers showed the employment implications. The transformed communities with year-round market access, reliable healthcare connections, and consistent school attendance illustrated the human impact. The renewed confidence that Africans felt about our problem-solving capabilities perhaps mattered most of all. For generations, we had internalized messages that Africa couldn't innovate, that development required foreign expertise, that African approaches were inferior. These mental chains had constrained what we attempted more than any material limitations. Tire-based roads shattered those psychological barriers by proving African innovation could outperform expensive foreign alternatives. All of this proved that Africa possessed problem-solving capacity we had been systematically taught to doubt by those who profited from our perceived inadequacy. The doubt served external interests by making us accept dependencies as inevitable rather than challenging ourselves to innovate. Breaking free from that doubt liberated African creativity and determination that had always existed but had been suppressed. The lesson extended far beyond infrastructure to every development challenge we faced across sectors. When we trusted African innovation and maintained unity against external pressure to remain dependent, we achieved results that genuinely served our interests rather than enriching those who profited from keeping Africa underdeveloped. This lesson applied to agriculture, energy, manufacturing, technology, healthcare, education, and every field where external actors claimed we needed their expensive interventions. The pattern repeated consistently across sectors. External actors insisted African problems required their costly solutions while actively discouraging us from exploring alternatives that would eliminate their profitable involvement. When we ignored those discouragements and pursued African innovation using local resources, we consistently discovered that locally appropriate solutions existed that served our interests far better than expensive imports designed for different contexts. The infrastructure revolution proved this pattern definitively and inspired confidence to apply the same approach everywhere. We stopped automatically accepting that development required massive foreign involvement and started asking systematically whether African alternatives existed. The question almost always revealed possibilities that external actors had never mentioned because their business models depended on us believing we needed them. By 2028, this shift in development mindset had transformed Africa's relationship with external actors fundamentally. We engaged as partners when genuine mutual interests existed, rather than as supplicants begging for assistance that came with chains attached. We evaluated all proposals based on whether they built African capacity or reinforced dependencies. We rejected arrangements that primarily served external interests regardless of how they were packaged. The infrastructure revolution that began with recycled tires on Burkina Faso roads in 2025 had evolved into continent-wide transformation of development approaches by 2028. Africa was claiming agency over our own development trajectory and proving we possessed capabilities to shape our future according to our interests and values. The journey was far from complete, but the direction was irreversibly established. Africa would develop through African innovation, African labor, African resources, and African determination. External actors could participate as genuine partners or become irrelevant. The choice was theirs. Africa was moving forward regardless.